Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest presentation of the Friends of History First Wednesday Lecture Series. I'm Ben Woodbury and of the Friends of History and will be your host today. These monthly lectures are being provided free of charge by the Friends of History on behalf of the New Mexico History Museum and through donations from our audience. These funds go directly to support the lecture series and, more importantly, the History Museum's programs and exhibits. Today, we are happy to welcome as our speaker John Gahate of the Pueblos of Laguna and Zuni of the Turkey and Badger clans. He is a staff educator at the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center in southwest Colorado. John is a frequent speaker on indigenous civilizations of the Western Hemisphere, southwestern indigenous civilizations, the history of New Mexico's Pueblo cultures, and New Mexico history as it applies to the indigenous civilizations of New Mexico. As a lecturer, John has spoken to such organizations as the University of New Mexico, the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, Coronado State Historic Site, the Nature Conservancy of Santa Fe, the National Park Service, the Sierra Club, and the Smithsonian Associates, to mention just a few. Today, John will speak on who are the Pueblos, the histories and legacies of the U.S. and Southwest Paleo-Indian to contemporary Pueblos, offering us a Native American perspective on Puebloan history. John, welcome to the Friends of History First Wednesday Lecture Series.
Well, thank you very much, Ben. I really appreciate first of all, the invitation and the consideration, and certainly for the audience who are going to be viewing this presentation. To begin with, in my mother's language, because of the languages that are still here in what we now call the state of New Mexico, these languages are essential in helping us understand who the people were and who they continue to be as a society, as a culture. So how we greet one another is Gawatsi, and that was my mother's language, and my father's language, which is different than my mother's language, we would say Keshe. And so it's really an honor to assist you and help and talk with you a little bit about the history and the legacy of the predecessors, the humans who were living in this region of the U.S. Southwest, long before the other side of the world decided to come to this side of the world. And one of the unique things about the Southwest is that we still have the evidence that exists that help us certainly learn from them. But at the same time, although we don't have all the evidence, what knowledge we do have is certainly speculative as well as theoretical in a sense of who the people were, connecting with what the indigenous narratives of those groups of people that are still here. So it's my honor to tell you a little bit about that today. So as we begin my presentation, what I'm going to do is share my screen with you and help and bring you and help you understand a little bit about what this presentation is all about. As I mentioned, I am John Jahadi. I'm one of the educators at the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center in Cortez, Colorado. Just let me briefly mention the fact that although I'm an educator there at this point in time and have been previously associated with the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center in Albuquerque, New Mexico, I do not speak for them or on behalf of them. What I will say as a descendant of those indigenous groups of people that we now refer to as Pueblo, I speak because of them, because our predecessors were here, our ancestors were here. We as a society, as a culture, as a group of human beings still have those components of what constitutes a stable agrarian society. And when you look at the images that I'm showing you, what it's showing you is really the legacy of those people who have always been here, who they are as human beings, who they are as people who found a way to exist in this environment. And so I read it to you in my mother's language, which we now refer to as Caris, and my father's language, which we now associate with Zuni, as well as certainly English. And all of these languages are elemental to who we are as human beings. One of the things that we as certainly educators and then those that rely on science to help us understand a little bit about the people is looking at the evidence that is here, especially in the Four Corners region of the United States. And we're certainly fortunate in that we still have the evidence that we get to go and visit. If anybody has ever been to Mesa Verde, Chaco Canyon, wherever we go, we see the evidence of what humans have been doing. But one of the things that perhaps I would like to kind of put out there for you to consider is that all of this information is certainly speculative as well as informative, but at the same time, it requires our participation as we think about what history really means. History oftentimes is not always written by those who it impacts. Obviously, you've heard the term before that history is only written by those who are the winners, but history should always work to be inclusive. So these are the things I would like to have you consider when we think about the indigenous peoples who have resided here in the Southwest for a very long time. The things that have impacted them, both environmentally, as well as those things that were imposed upon them, those things that they adjusted to and adapted to so that they were able to sustain and maintain their culture and their civilizations. And then there are some of our fellow indigenous populations who at some point were unable to do that. And that's why many of these indigenous cultures are no longer on this planet, simply because of the impacts to their environment. So those are the things I'm going to talk about. And all of these things you see on your screen are those factors that have changed their lives. It's fortunate for some of our community, our indigenous communities, that they have been resilient. And these things are still very important part of their communities. When we think about watching a movie or a TV or something, we get these things called disclaimers, things that help us understand a little bit about perhaps something that might be of concern to you. In this particular case, if you go to the movie or turn on Netflix, you see this symbol and basically informs you that this is for a mature audience, that there's going to be some violence. There might be some sex involved in this discussion or this presentation. Also, the language might be not something that you would appreciate. And certainly the things that were here, the narratives that are part of this presentation might not necessarily be part of your narrative. And so we see these as disclaimers. However, as a lifelong educator and certainly a lifelong learner, I've created my own to kind of help you as an audience understand a little bit about the things we're going to talk about. And so certainly the lifelong learner is everything that we as human beings continue to do, no matter our age. From the earliest time we can begin to think about something, about our environment. Maybe we want to be inquisitive. That's what a lifelong learner is. When we consider the history of the state of New Mexico, obviously there's violence here. Violence has always been part of this culture. That's what human beings have always done to one another. Sex has always been part of humankind. That's the only reason why we have more human beings on this planet of ours. Certainly, religion has always been a component as it applies to the state of New Mexico because it changed the lives of the people once the other side of the world came to this side of the world. And certainly, race has always been an important part of what we now call the United States of America because it implies who was going to be accepted, who was going to be allowed to be a citizen of this, what we now call the United States. History has certainly always been a source of contention, especially if we think about the most recent term, the critical race theory. These things are all part of what history is. And sometimes if we're not inclusive, if we don't ask or seek out the entire story of what it means to have history, we're really not being inclusive and we're really not being thorough. That's what I hope I can accomplish by presenting a little bit about who the human beings were on this side of the world for the past 10,000 years plus, because we've had new evidence to indicate that humans have been on this side of the world for at least 23,000 years. That's the current understanding of the scientific community. So what I'm going to talk about are the things listed on your screen. Who the human beings who were here, how they began to form certain aspects of their civilization, what has changed for those communities, how they're significantly different from one group to another, and what incorporates them in the present day. Why are some of these communities still very prevalent today? Why are they still here? And what is it that allows them and encourages them to sustain and maintain them as a society, and most importantly, as a human culture that's still very prevalent, especially as it applies to the state of New Mexico. Now, there are some differences between Colorado, Arizona, and Utah as it applies to those indigenous peoples, but specifically as it applies to New Mexico, there is something uniquely different for them, and then we'll talk about that a little bit later on in my presentation. One of the important things I've that I've learned as being an educator is the terms that we use, how I help a student understand a little bit about a specific subject or topic that I'm talking about. And so if a student or an audience is not knowledgeable of some of these terms, sometimes the information I share with you is not always understood. And that's the unique thing about humankind, is that as humans progress and evolve to whatever status they improve, what has to change is the sophistication of their language. The language so that I can pass along knowledge, I can pass along to learn skills, I can pass along history in the legacy of those who preceded me. And if my language is very limited or very minimal, then I cannot really accomplish that. So I really consider a vocabulary an important part of how we pass this information along. Well, two of the words I really think that are important is the word cognizant. Scientists have helped us understand this term. What it implies is that human beings began at some point to understand who they were as an individual. And then as individuals realized who they were, what it means to be a society or a community, how we work together, how we address issues. And through progression, then the next concept or the next step up of the sophistication of humankind is how we deal with this thing called death, the afterlife, the things that make us human, that we learn how to deal with someone in our community that passes on. Certainly, we understand that some animals, some primates, as well as some mammals, have some way of expressing a loss of someone in their community. We know that elephants mourn. Our pet cats and dogs, they go through a period of depression, perhaps when someone in the family passes away. And so that term cognizance is that gradual differentiation of who we are as human beings and our understanding of death. And the next term I want to kind of point out is this concept of autonomy. This is a self-described, self-accepted component of what it means to be a society, that I have a sense of who I am as a person, that I'm different from that person over there, and that as a collective society, even though we may all look alike, I'm still me. And if I look in my reflection in the water or in a mirror, I know it's me, it's not someone else. And so that's the fundamental element of what it means to be a human society, whether it's on the other side of the world or this side of the world. So all of these things terms are important in the description of who the human beings were. As lastly, you see the terms they have seen marked out in red. The one term I would like to point out is the term anasazi. Currently, the scientific community has chosen not to use that term, not because it's pejorative or derogative. It's just it was not completely indicative of who the indigenous peoples were here in the Western Hemisphere. When the first anthropologists and archaeologists came to the Southwest region, majority of their influences and perhaps description were by our Dene, our Navajo neighbors, and it was a term that was associated to them or from them. And so not everyone completely agrees on its complete interpretation. Some people say it means the old ones or the old enemies, the old warriors. So in doing with that understanding, the current day contemporary Pueblo communities felt that it was really not indicative of their predecessors. So through lobbying and as Pueblo educators and students move through the profession of archaeology and anthropology, along with a very important Pueblo anthropologist whose name was Dr. Edward Dozer. They began to say or encourage the scientific community that this term was really not respectful of what we now call the Pueblo community. So right now, the term that is used is Ancestral Puebloan, which has replaced the term Anasazi. So not that it's bad, it's just that it's really not indicative or really respectful of those. It applies to those who resided here in the Southwest. For those of us who have gone to public school in any form, that includes myself. This is what we learned about what we now call the United States of America. Those groups of people who came here, they were certainly seeking either economic freedom or religious freedom. But when we consider that what was here in the Western Hemisphere, throughout the entire hemisphere, there were many indigenous cultures here. There were many indigenous sophisticated agrarian societies that were here. There were many different types of governance. There was perhaps some that were autocratic. There was some that were perhaps a little more community or democratic, perhaps even might say a socialist construct, so that everybody contributed and participated. And so, although most of us, including myself, have been taught this, what few of us as US citizens are not taught is that there was significant history long before those images, and that history was contributed to our understanding of what it means to be the United States. When we look at a timeline of what most of us are taught, especially as it applies to the Western Hemisphere, it begins in 1492. Obviously, as science begins to find and interpret more evidence of humankind, what we see is significant contributing factors of the human beings who resided in here. And especially as it applies to New Mexico, with the findings the footprints that were found at White Sands National Monument 2.5 years ago, the previous understanding of humankind in the Western Hemisphere, Homo sapiens, that prior to about 50 years ago, most people thought that human beings really hadn't been on this side of the world perhaps no more than 50 years. However, with the findings of the footprints at White Sands National Monument, the current thinking is they have human beings, Homo sapiens, have been on this side of the world for at least 23,000 years. Although we have not yet found or uncovered specific human remains to give us a better understanding, we have some limited information. So the current understanding is at least 21 to 23,000 years that humans have been on this side of the world. And more importantly, one of the important things that has allowed humankind to reside, to evolve, and certainly progress to many indigenous peoples here throughout the Western Hemisphere, and specifically in the US Southwest, is the human cultivation of corn. Once corn becomes the major commodity and the produce that is produced here, now you have the ability to sustain and maintain a society. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. But we know when corn was begun to be cultivated by human beings, and that was at least 9,000 years ago, it takes a period of time for it to come up to what we now call northern Mexico. It takes a little bit more longer to come up to what we now call the US Southwest. But it only takes perhaps less than 1,000 years for it to actually for corn to acclimate and to be grown throughout what we now call the continental United States. So by the time the Pilgrims arrived in Massachusetts and Jamestown is founded in 1602, that they're growing corn. But corn, we know that corn was cultivated initially at one point associated to a specific plant called teosinte. And that, again, we have scientists identified that as being at least 9,000 years ago. So for the most part, if we are knowledgeable and become those lifelong learners, we can understand that science helps us understand a little bit about the humankind on this side of the world as it applies to those civilizations that it resided in what we now call the Western Hemisphere. To consider what constitutes a human society is that as a group of human beings living together, these are the principal components of what it means to be a civil society. What constitutes them to exist as a group as compared to a herd of animals or a flock of birds or just a group of something. These are the principal things that most anthropologists, most social scientists agree. You have to have these things that allow a group of humans to exist rather than just a bunch of people. These things bring them together. They have some commonality. They have buy-ins that we all agree that this is, as a group, we're going to support and defend and nurture this concept. These four principles are essential for humankind to reside in wherever they choose to live, whether it's in the Amazonian jungle, whether it's up in northern, what we now call Alaska, or any place on this planet where humans congregate. These things are essential so that they can exist as a society. They can evolve and then learn to nurture and develop their own cultural components. Science helps us understand, simply because of the evidence that is collected, that we see distinct differences between the majority of the different human civilizations throughout what we now call the Four Corners region or the US Southwest. Simply by looking at either the tools that were used, the kind of housing, the kind of materials that were used for baskets or pottery, and perhaps even the kind of environment that they chose. Scientists have found components that say, well, this, whatever this group made certainly looks different from that group over there. And as a result, these are the terms that now scientists, anthropologists use to differentiate one group from another, either from the pottery that's created, the designs, perhaps maybe the kind of crops they grew, the kind of houses they existed in. These are still very prevalent descriptors and terms that were used because, unfortunately, many of the different societies that resided in the Four Corners region didn't leave us a lot of information other than the evidence that we still find and are still excavating throughout the Southwest. And these, the remnants of these civilizations we get to go to whenever we go to Mesa Verde, Chaco Canyon, Casa Grande, any other place, Montezuma's Castle. There's ample evidence. There's just a multitude of evidence throughout the Southwest, and certainly we're fortunate to live in the Southwest because of the environment. We have these structures that are still there. Whereas in other places, either because of the moisture content, the humidity, and the environment, those things decay. But here in the Southwest, we're fortunate in that regard to have them as national parks, national monuments. We can still go see them. And it's mindful for us to visit those places with respect because we're visiting places where human beings were actually living at some point in time. Again, the four other components of what constitutes a civil society, these principles have to be part of any human society to have some degree of understanding of how I'm going to make my life better, growing better crops, having a better weapon, having some way of understanding how I can preserve food, that I have process improvement concepts, that I have strategic planning. So I know that I need to grow enough food for not just tomorrow, but next month, maybe next year or the next couple of years, because I can't depend upon the environment, the weather, whether there's going to be a drought. All of these are essential to what constitutes a human society. To consider how to prepare food. Oftentimes we think about cooking food. Well, that's sort of examples of chemistry. To understand about how we deal with specific ailments, childbirth. Those are concepts we now even still use when we as human beings reside on this planet. And then certainly how we deal with this thing called death, that we just don't leave someone out here on the ground to stink and smell or let animals come and chomp on them. Most societies develop some sort of behaviors or constructs of, well, I'm going to bury this person or cremate this person or mummify this person and then celebrate their life simply through ceremonies or funerals or whatever it is any society exists. And lastly, the most important thing that we see throughout the Southwest is that eventually there's some commerce that gets developed. That we see seashells at Chaco, we see cacao or chocolate at Mesa Verde and other places. We see evidence of transportation of ideas from one group to another. The underlying premise, I think, is helpful for us to understand. If I'm going to trade with another person, two things have to exist. We have to have an understanding that my language, that I'm helping you understand what I have to give, is of certain value. And with that understanding, we come up with this concept of quantity and quality, that your pile of whatever it is you have is going to be equal to my pile of whatever it is I have. And so that no one gets shortchanged. We have an understanding and our sophistication of our languages and our concepts of quantity and quality had to be a component of that. So these are things that are helpful for us to understand who the human beings that were resided here since the beginning of humankind on this side of the world. Science helps us, as I mentioned before. This is a picture of the footprints that were found at White Sands National Monument. That was 2.5 years ago. And through testing of the pollen that were embedded in the footprints, we now know at least these footprints were made at least 21 plus thousand years ago. And it's at the same time that mammoths and mastodons were still here, that the societies that existed here were predominantly hunter-gatherer societies. Agriculture and crop growing was really not a part of them as their component as a society. So this is what we see, and New Mexico contributes a lot to the history of not just the United States or even just the New Mexico alone. History in New Mexico contributes a lot to world history, and when we look at humankind in the Western Hemisphere, there's a lot of evidence in that. As you notice, I'm wearing a shirt, and I wore this particular shirt because New Mexico contributes a lot in that regard. When the history of archaeoastronomy, the history of humankind, the observation of the solstices and the equinoxes and the eclipses, the same celestial things that we get to see, that you get perhaps later on this evening, tonight, tomorrow, the sun comes out, the moon comes out, the stars come out. Those are the same celestial objects that the people who were living here 10,000 years ago are the same ones we get to observe even in the year 2025. One of the things that science helps us understand is at some point, the people who were living here began to become or had developed certain skill sets, that they had been able to exist as a society. Certainly, obviously, for those who know New Mexico, we don't have a specific kind of environment that is always indicative and allows us to exist without too much degree of troubles. Our rainfall is always questionable. Our snowfall is always questionable. Water isn't always the easiest thing to access. And certainly the climate and environment of what New Mexico is, and specifically the Southwest, is always challenging. But for people to have lived here for as long as they have, obviously they had to be mindful of the environment. They had to plan ahead. They had to use strategic planning for them to exist as human beings. And so as a result of that, these are the things that science helps us understand about the human beings that have resided here. They resided here for a significant amount of time. One of the most prominent civilizations that existed was the Chacoan ancestral cultural group that lived in the outliers that science helps us understand. And for the most part, they resided in that region, which we now call Chaco Culture National Historic Park. They lived there for almost 400 years. And when you consider that, consider next year, this country, the United States of America, will be celebrating 250 years. So that means that people who lived at Chaco lived there for almost twice as long as the people, as what we now call this country. And so to give them the credit that they were certainly using science principles without really understanding the principles themselves, but they were farmers. They knew how to build multiple story structures. They knew how to observe the celestial movements. Those are the things that allowed them to exist as a society and as a culture that continued to evolve. The images you're going to be seeing in the next few slides, there are evidence of humankind in the Western Hemisphere, finding ways to exist in the environment. The most common ideas of what it means to be a human being, the three things we need. Number one, we need food and water. We can't exist without food and water for very long. Obviously, water, certainly food, we can last a little bit longer. Obviously, we need air, but food and water are essential for us to exist as a society and just about any species on this planet. The next thing we need is we need shelter. And we see that throughout many places throughout the Southwest. We see shelter, examples of shelter that have been used depending upon the environment throughout the Southwest. This one, as you see, is in southern Arizona between Phoenix and Tucson. This is Casa Grande. And this is a place where we know human beings were living here. But to build a structure that like this, that is a multiple story structure, people always wonder, why would they do that? We don't know because they didn't give us enough information, but we can certainly extrapolate or come up with a scientific idea. Maybe they just wanted to get closer to their spiritual entity, or maybe just closer to the stars to look at that. Those are currently some of the current understandings as it applies to the human beings that existed in that region. Another place is very prominent. Many people go throughout the entire world is Mesa Verde. This is Cliff Palace at Mesa Verde. Obviously, to have enough knowledge, skill sets, workforce, as well as food to sustain and maintain a society, topped with the fact that there was a collective understanding that we do this together. No one can do this by themselves. That is a collective society. Not only do they have food and water, not only did they have some way to provide shelter, the next thing we need to do, we as human beings that allow us to live wherever we choose to live, we need a collective society or a community. No one does this by themselves. And so for us to then experience Mesa Verde, Chaco, and the many places, I hope that we will be able to take time to realize that it was humans who did this, but what was required of them? What was essential for them to exist? The image you see is Pueblo Bonito at Chaco. Again, is probably the most iconic of all the indigenous examples of humankind in the Four Corners region. But not only is it just one structure, in Chaco there are 14 what we call great houses. They're an example of a society that had a collective understanding that the only way we can do this is if we do this together. There was a component of some social structure. There was some component of sophistication of language, because if I tell someone to go get a rock, well, I have to be specific about what kind of rock. Is it a round rock? Is it a heavy rock? Is it a flat rock? Is it a black rock? Sophisticated language has to become sophisticated enough so that I can accomplish the things I need to do so my civilization, my society can exist. And then there obviously had to be some delegation of governance, that obviously there are going to be the builders, somebody's got to grow the crops, somebody's got to prepare the food for those who are working. Perhaps there's children who are playing, there's elders that are there. Everyone finds their place in a society. I'm sure you've heard the word where it takes the term that says it takes a village. When I consider, my personal opinion, when I consider Pueblo Benito, a village simply implies the structures. But when I say a community, that implies it's the individual human beings that not only do they have buy-in to the collective understanding, but now I'm responsible for my contribution, that stewardship of what it means to be a society. So these are the examples of what New Mexico contributes to our understanding of those human beings that resided in this region for at least 1,000 years ago. Humankind has certainly we see the examples of humankind in the Southwest region. These are the examples of those principles that allowed them to exist here. Many times when we think about humankind, it's important for us to consider this concept of life and death. What we do, this thing that makes us different from one another, this spirit, this soul, this entity, this aura, or if you're a Star Wars fan, this force that exists in all of us, that as a society we find some way to accomplish the things we do. And yet at the same time, there has to be some form of governance, that if perhaps there's some individual within my community that either is a aggressor, maybe someone has not been a complete buy-in to the society, maybe someone is causing problems, maybe even kills another member of my community, is there some way we address that particular issue? Those are the things that should be and could be incorporated when we think about the indigenous populations that resided throughout the Southwest, and the things that we observe and get a chance to visit. Those of us here in New Mexico have certainly learned about the history of those who came to this side of the world. One of the things I'd like to point out is that we oftentimes use the term Spanish. Not that it's wrong, it's just not quite completely correct. Spain does not become an actual country with a constitution until 1779. The image you see, this occurred in 1540, almost 250 years before Spain actually becomes a country. And certainly we have said it many, many times. The Spaniards came here, or Don Juan de Oñate was a Spaniard. Well, they were actually representatives of the Spanish crown, the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, not so much the country of Spain per se. They were representatives of the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. And we know that because most of us have learned that history has always helped us understand a little bit about who the groups of people who came here and found a different environment and began to understand that they were in a different place. Most of us have been taught, including myself, having gone to public school, that they were looking for gold. One of the things that several very good researchers like Richard and Shirley Flint, who have done extensive research on the Coronado expedition, as well as others, they don't dispute it. What they do is offer us a different perspective in that at the time that Coronado comes to what we now call New Mexico, they were the Spanish crown and others that were representing the Spanish crown were still very much expecting that any day now they would find that passage to what we now call China or Asia at that time, which was pretty much the same reason that Columbus came westward, was his effort to try to get to Asia and to the things that were important to the commodities and the commerce of Europe at that time. That was really what Coronado was, not so much gold. They was not looking solely for the 7 cities of gold, but rather a continued passage to what we now call China. But it was really that idea that eventually gets changed because of eventually several years later, because of this man we now know as Ferdinand Magellan, who finally makes it around the world and actually proves that there's a bigger ocean between this side, what we now call the Americas, and the Eastern Hemisphere. But he unfortunately gets killed in what we now call the Philippines. But eventually his crew make it back to the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, and it helps them realize that they are nowhere close to getting close to Asia. Eventually that changes. But these are the things that help us understand in afterwards that we can certainly give the representatives of the Spanish crown credit because they wrote stuff down. We can go to their diaries. We can go to the things that were written because they had to report to the King of Spain at that time. And so we can look at the resources and the ideas that they're thinking about. So all of these things were elemental in the indigenous populations, what we now call the state of New Mexico, long before Coronado, Cortez, and other groups were here. These were essential to the existence of all of these civilizations that existed here in what we now call New Mexico. And the other thing that's helpful for us, especially if we talk about the history of New Mexico, the first actual person to come to what we now call New Mexico was not from Europe. He was not from any of the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. He was not a white person. He was not a Christian. The actual first person to encounter what we now call the Pueblos, well, they were not called Pueblos at the time, but he was the first person to come here, was actually from Northern Africa. He was from what we now call the country of Morocco. He was from the groups of people that have always been referred to, who refer to themselves as Amazigh. The Romans and others called them the Berbers. Eventually, they're called Moors, but they are the groups of people that call themselves Amazigh. They've always been the indigenous populations of the Atlas Mountains of what we now call Morocco. The man we now know as Esteban, the Spanish named him that, and he was captured in Morocco by the Portuguese in 1526. He was sold to a Spanish nobleman. They stayed on the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon until 1528. They sailed to Hispaniola. We now call that the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And then eventually, several months later, they connected and were sailing with a ship, the Narvaez expedition to Florida. Unfortunately, they got caught in a hurricane. They were shipwrecked on just north of what we now call Tampa Bay, Florida. They were expecting to get rescued. Unfortunately, they never did. Eventually, they decided, well, maybe we could walk back to where we came from, and thinking they would just go west, but they had no idea how far they were. No, they had no idea where they were. Obviously, there was no Google Maps or any kind of a satellite maps for them to kind of reflect upon. They were simply going on their own, whatever limited knowledge they had. Now, I've never been to the southeast coast, especially Louisiana, as we call it now. But obviously, they're walking along Florida, the Panhandle, Alabama, Mississippi, and going into the Louisiana. And it's not obviously with swamps, a bunch of critters, not a nice place to be walking around, but they continue nevertheless. And for the next 8 years, they're trying to find their way. And slowly but surely, people are dying along the way. When they shipwrecked in Florida, there were 300 souls that shipwrecked in Florida. 8 years later, they were finally found. And of those 300 souls that were found, 300 souls that were shipwrecked, there were only 4 left. And one of them was the man we now know as called Esteban. He was found in 1535. They were taken back to Mexico City, what we now call Mexico City. The viceroy of New Spain at the time, whose last name was Mendoza, interrogated them, trying to find out, where have you been? Where did all this other stuff go? And Esteban told them that he had learned of people living up in this region. So in 1539, Esteban, with a priest whose name was Fray Marcos de Niza, came up into what we now call New Mexico. They came actually along the border of Arizona and New Mexico. And if anyone has ever driven along I-10 from Tucson to Deming, it's not a very pleasant place. I drove that way about 2 months ago. It's quite desolate. There's hardly anything there, but that's the way they came in 1539. They actually come to the Pueblo of Zuni. It was called Hawiku at the time. It's still called Hawiku right now in our Zuni languages. And unfortunately, Esteban, who was sort of the head person trying to get ahead of everybody, starts doing stupid stuff. He starts making demands to the people who he finds there, demanding food and gold and women and water. And unfortunately, the people kind of get pissed off at him and unfortunately kill him. The priest, Fray Marcos de Niza, who accompanies him, unfortunately never really saw this event. He was still kind of far in the back, but nevertheless, he returns back to Spain and begins to tell this story of this, what we now call the fabled cities of gold, that he thinks there's gold up here. There's these communities that are growing corn. There are multiple storage structures. So a year later, 1540, that's when Coronado begins to come up this way. Since that time, that's the narrative of what the representatives of the Spanish crown have incorporated. However, for the Pueblo people, we know that this is the first person that came to the Pueblo Zuni and eventually changed the whole world of those groups that we now refer to as Pueblos. By 1600, at least a year after Oñate, forgot his name, Don Juan de Oñate. When Don Juan de Oñate comes, what is understood about those groups of people that are living here now is that there was something that changed for the representatives of the Spanish crown. This is one of the earliest maps that we see and was drawn of those communities that resided predominantly along what we now call the Rio Grande. Science helps us understand that for some reason, we don't know exactly why, because we're not privy to that knowledge. The people who are living up in Mesa Verde, in Chaco, somewhere between 1150 and 1225, something was changing for them as a society, that they decided to leave that place, not suddenly, but over that 75-year period. By 1225, majority of those places that we now call monuments, like Mesa Verde, Chaco, and other places, they're no longer inhabited. Oftentimes people will say, well, where did they go? Did they just disappear? What the current understanding as it applies to the scientific community, archaeology and anthropology, is that the descendants of the people who inhabited Chaco and Mesa Verde are those groups we now refer to as Pueblo. couple of things that help them come to that conclusion is the societal structure as for them as a society, large communities, some commonalities in terms of that they were predominantly completely, totally agrarian societies. Number three, that they were simply using the same architecture that we see at Mesa Verde and Chaco. And so that's why most archaeologists, anthropologists associate those factors and say that the descendants of those who inhabited the Four Corners region from Chaco, Mesa Verde, Joven, Huip, um, Chimney Rock, and other places are those that at some point decide to then choose to live closer to what we now call the Rio Grande. And scientists have also found by using dendrochronology, or the tree rings of structures, such as in the kivas, in the houses, and the places that people built, that this is when they began to reside predominantly along the what we now call the Rio Grande. It's understood that these civilizations began to reside from what we now call Taos, New Mexico, all the way down to Socorro, New Mexico, that 200-mile long corridor of the Rio Grande, that there was all of these different communities, some perhaps no larger than 500 people in a group versus maybe 5,000 people in a large community. And all of these communities were somehow incorporated in this kind of map. For those of us who live here in New Mexico, places like Santa Fe, there was a large different communities there. In the what we now call the Albuquerque metro area, there were perhaps 4 large communities there. Socorro, New Mexico, there were probably 3 large communities. If we drive along North 14 from Tijeras, New Mexico, which was a pueblo at that time, all the way up to Santa Fe, we come to La Cienega, Madrid, uh, and other communities there, San Marcos, Galisteo, those were pueblos. If we drive north on I-25, north of Bernalillo, and we see the frontage road, we come to Algodones. That was a pueblo. Bernalillo was a pueblo. If we take the road that goes from Espanola all the way up to Abiquiu, there were also pueblos along the river there. So the 19 pueblos we see in New Mexico today is just only a small portion of other pueblos that existed here, predominantly along the Rio Grande. And then we also take our other neighbors to the west of us in Arizona, our Hopi neighbors. They fall under the same social structure of multiple story structures that as a society they lived together, and they were predominantly agrarian. Oftentimes people or scientists will try to differentiate different societies, saying that they were nomadic versus sedentary. Well, my personal understanding of a nomadic society is that you're either following your herds or your food source and looking to find out places that are best to live. But when we think about many different our neighbors throughout the different many different societies throughout the Southwest, there were many other of our neighbors, our the neighbors, or Navajo, Apaches, Comanches, Utes, Paiutes, Tarahumara, Yaqui, many other different indigenous groups throughout this entire Southwest region of what we now call the U.S. as well as Mexico. And maybe some of them were not completely sedentary, but they perhaps maybe had a place that they would live in certain parts of the season and versus another part of the season. We still have that today. Perhaps you know this other term, we call them snowbirders. You might live up in Wausau, Wisconsin in the summertime because you get to fish, you get to canoe, you get to kind of have a really nice environment for the summertime. But when the weather changes, it gets 400 degrees below zero, the ice gets 4 feet thick. Well, then you go down to your second home in, say, West Palm Beach or Tucson. And then when the seasons change, then you go back. It's not like you're wandering around or you're a nomad. It's just you have a summer home and a winter home, summer home and a winter home. So our ancestors or our neighbors perhaps were like that. They had a summer home, perhaps maybe up in the mountains because it's cooler. Maybe there's more rain, there's more animals to hunt, there's more material I could use for my housing, but then it gets too cold or the winter comes, it snows. I don't want to be around that. So I go down in the valley and I can exist there until the seasons change. So that was what was different for the Pueblo cultures compared to those that were somewhat seasonally migratory. These cultures at some point become permanent. They find a place to stay here. They don't move. They don't go on vacation. They simply stay here throughout the entire year because to be a farmer, takes a great deal of preparation, problem-solving skills, strategic planning, and I can't just plant my crop say and then walk off and do something else. I have to nurture it. I have to cultivate it. I have to make sure that it grows. And if something changes, if there's some impact to the environment, not enough rain, not enough water, maybe plants and animals or diseases or insects come, I have to make sure that my crop is going to be produce enough food for those who live in my society. And thinking of that difference between those groups that were predominantly sedentary and compared to those that were somewhat migratory, this is what perhaps is an understanding of why the term Pueblo begins to be applied to these groups compared to those other groups that were somewhat seasonally migratory. The word Pueblo certainly is not our word when we think about us as a society. Myself as a Pueblo member of the Pueblo of Laguna and a member of the Pueblo of Zuni, as well as other Pueblos, the remaining 19 that are here. I'm sure perhaps many of you have gone to many of our feast days to if our different Pueblos. When we speak English, we might say, well, I'm from Pueblo this or Pueblo that. But when we speak our own language, we say we use the language we use a term that has always been part of our languages. As many of people who reside in New Mexico, we know there are currently 5 distinct languages spoken among the current 19 pueblos. But the term pueblo begins to be used by the Spanish simply because it begins, perhaps it's my understanding that they begin to differentiate one group from another. Certainly the word pueblo in Spanish means a town or a village, but it also means people. But it originates from the Latin word populos, which means people. And so perhaps maybe when the Spanish were, or representatives of the Spanish crown were coming to this region, they would see a community or village or town off in the distance. And in Spanish, they might say, Los pueblos allí, which basically means there's a town over there, or La Puebla aquí, oh, there's another town over here. And so eventually that concept or that term begins to apply to this community over there and that community over there. And the word Pueblo begins to apply to the structures or the entity of what these villages or towns look like. But eventually what changes for the Spanish crown began as early as 1542. This was because of a publication that was written by a Dominican priest whose name was Bartholomew de las Casas. He had been, his father had sailed with Columbus on the last voyage to the Western Hemisphere. And because of his service to Columbus, Columbus gave him some land and slaves on the island of Hispaniola, Dominican Republic, and Haiti. This man had a son whose name was Bartholomew de las Casas. He began to see how cruel the representatives of the Spanish crown were treating the indigenous populations of those islands we now call the Caribbean. He was moved by this kind of violence, so he gave away his land, he set his slaves free, and he joined the Dominican monastery. He became a Dominican priest. And in 1542, he wrote a report to the Spanish crown. It's called A Brief Report on the Destruction of the Indies. And what he's trying to help the king understand is that perhaps these are human beings, that we should look at them as human beings with a soul, and then perhaps maybe think about bringing them into the Catholic fold, which was the predominant belief system of the Spanish crown, Ferdinand and Isabella at the time. And so as a result of that, the Spanish began to see these groups that we now refer to as Pueblos distinctly different than other groups that they simply saw as either barbarian, savages, nomadic, or whatever term that does not apply a society. And because of that, eventually what changes for the Spanish crown, 2 things. Number one, they began to simply impose a feudal construct. It was called the encomienda. And the encomienda is much like the Northern European feudal system, where the landowner had owned the land and the serfs, or the people who were the farmers on the land, were forced to give tribute or pay taxes to the landowner rather than simply killing everybody. because much like the Romans, when the Romans invaded a country and colonized a country, they didn't kill everybody, because if you kill everybody, who's going to grow the crops? Who's going to build the roads? Who's going to do the things you need to get done? You might have to do that yourself, but if you somehow bring them into your society, then you have a workforce, not necessarily a slave force, but at least you have a workforce. And so this is what changed when, after 1550, up until 1620, when eventually Don Juan de Oñate comes into this region, that they incorporate the encomienda. The encomienda basically was the landowner who was given a land right, a land grant to reside here. But in addition to owning the land, the next thing the landowner was responsible for, not only just collecting taxes and tribute from the indigenous population, but the next thing that they were held accountable was for the spiritual belief systems of those who were their serfs. The picture you see, obviously, perhaps some of you have been to Acoma Pueblo, and on the far left, you see that church. That church was begun to be built in 1602. When you consider that 1602, that's 5 years before Jamestown is founded, and 15 years even before the Pilgrims arrive in Massachusetts, that the Spanish are forcing the people who lived in Acoma, as well as other pueblos, to build churches so they could attend. But to assume that premise, you have to assume one important premise before that, that you see them as human beings, because you Christianize human beings. You only Christianize those that have a soul. People, or those that you don't see as worthy of the Catholic faith at the time, were simply being persecuted, killed, and certainly tortured. Because at the same time, they're building churches at Acoma, at San Ildefonso, at Santo Domingo, and other places. On the other side of the world, there's something going on. That's called the Spanish Inquisition. And that lasted up until the early 1800s, that people who were not seen worthy of the Catholic faith were simply being persecuted, killed, tortured, and burned at the stake. But here on this side of the world, they're forcing people to build churches. And to do that, you have to accept them as a human being. And as a result of those two things, bringing them into the Catholic fold, bringing them into the encomienda construct as a society, two things occur. The Spanish crown begins to implement what we now call the Pueblo League. And the Pueblo League was a way to measure out the land and differentiate it one group from another, saying, if I measure out this land for you over there, you guys are over there, and you guys are over here. And so as a result of that, this image that you see on your screen is a representation of perhaps what may have constituted how the representatives of the Spanish crown began to measure out these lands that we now call Pueblos, and therefore the pretty much many very prominent places here in the state of New Mexico. I'm sure many of you have driven around the state of New Mexico, especially northern New Mexico. These land grants are still very prevalent. If you've ever driven up to Santa Fe, New Mexico, the first sign you see before you even get into town, it says you're entering the Cristobal de la Sierra land grant. The largest land grant in Albuquerque is still the remnants of the Elena Gallegos land grant. These land grants were established by representatives of the Spanish crown, an edict from the Spanish king to say, if you come here, you live here 5 years, you and your family can own this land into perpetuity, that you can tax and draw tribute from the serfs or the indigenous population, but you have to be responsible for their overall religious welfare. And as a result of that, these land grants are still not only measured out then, but they are still very prevalent today. This is an example of what it perhaps may have been as it applies to these land grants. A land grant was a measurement established by this king, and it was 5,000 vadas, or 5,000 lengths of a specific cane. It turns out that 1 league at the time was about 3.2 miles. And from the center of the community where the Spanish had built a church, they measured a league in all the 4 cardinal directions. So it turns out it's 6.4 miles one way and 6.4 miles the other way. And it comes out to, if I multiply those two sides of my square together, it comes out to 41.96 square miles that the Spanish crown says, okay, the Pueblo of Isleta is over there, the Pueblo of Santa Ana is over there, and that these communities were actually measured out. putting it into our understanding of what it means, what an acre is, if I multiply the square miles and know how many acres in a square mile, if I multiply those two together, then it turns out the Pueblo League had approximately 26,214 square acres of land that the Spanish crown acknowledged to differentiate one group from another. Obviously, these land grants are still very prevalent because we know that in 1970, President Nixon returned the Blue Lake, which was part of their land grant, back to the Pueblo of Taos, because through legislation and the courts, Taos Pueblo was able to prove that these land grants established by a sovereign, at the time the Spanish crown, acknowledged by the kingdom or the emperor of Mexico at the end when Mexico and Spain, Mexico wins its independence from Spain, and then eventually at the end of the Mexican-American War, the United States agrees to these land grants. So Taos was able to acquire its Blue Lake back. And then in 2016, President Obama returned the western side of that image that you saw behind me, that western side of that mountain, simply because it incorporated those land grant specifications that were acknowledged as early as approximately around 1620, perhaps even later, as we have found out in many, many forms. So these land grants are still very prevalent today. Bernalillo, Belen, they stem from those land grants that are coming from what we now call these understanding of who is a human being, and then how we work to bring them into the Catholic fold. As we think about the colonization and the occupation of the lands we now call the state of New Mexico, as compared to Arizona, Utah, and Colorado, it is that understanding between the acceptance of the human beings who were here and how it changed their lives. These are significant historical dates as it applies to why the Pueblos, we now call Pueblos, are still as resilient, their culture, their legacy, everything that embodies them as a human society still exists in spite of those things that have been imposed upon them, both certainly by the environment, but as well as those things that were incorporated by the impact of colonization into the homelands of now what we call our Pueblos. We share that in many, many forms as it applies to the history of New Mexico. And it's helpful for us to understand, or at least that we should be able to incorporate them in a certain way. And so as a result of that, we should be able to help others understand the contribution that New Mexico contributes as it applies to what we now consider the United States of America, that New Mexico is elemental to what it means to be a human society, that without these land grants, we would not have autonomy. These canes you see are representative of the Spanish crown acknowledging the autonomy, the right to differentiate one group from another, that their sophistication of their culture and their languages are still very prevalent. And so when we elect our leaders, we have King's Day, January 6th, to acknowledge that we understand what our leaders do. We validate their leadership. It's that transition that I acknowledge that now it's your turn to lead this community. That's what these canes represent, the autonomy that's part of as a society. These cultures, these components of our Pueblo societies, although different from our neighbors throughout the Southwest, help us understand a little bit about why the Pueblo people revolted in 1680. It was not just because of freedom per se. It was not just because of being oppression. It was the potential loss of everything that existed to them as a society. What their predecessors had created, the language, their very identity, their very existence was at threat. And as a result of that, under the leadership of Popé, it was important that the Pueblo people took the responsibility to ensure that future generations would not know, the future generation would know that they were here, that every element, the element of them as a society, as a human group of people, that we are still here. And so as it applies to New Mexico, we celebrate that autonomy, that sense of the ability to still be here. So when we speak our languages, when we have the celebrations of our feast days, we are simply validating the lives of those who have preceded us. And though we certainly have progressed, that we as Pueblo citizens, that we go to school, we get college degrees, we're academics, we're public servants, we're healthcare practitioners, we contribute and participate beyond what the United States is as it applies to us as US citizens, we still are here. And all of the things that contribute to us as a society help us find our sense of place, help us know that we are really the only reason why we are here is because of those who came before us, all the things they gave to us, the culture, the legacy, the history of everything that embodies us, along with the 19 Pueblos in New Mexico, our Arizona neighbors, our Hopi neighbors, that without that resilient factor, that we could still be able to let future generations know that other generations have come before us, that other groups of human beings have been here before us, but we work diligently to incorporate science, technology, the tools of the present day to ensure that we help us understand who we are as Pueblo people. This applies is very important because not very many indigenous societies are fortunate enough that they are still here. Certainly, we have these 555, 575 indigenous federally recognized tribes here in the United States, but we still work to ensure that the stories, the legacy of those who came before us are still very prevalent and that's accurate, that history is incorporated. Most of us understand that wherever state we live, that there are some reservations that are still here. But for us as Pueblos in the state of New Mexico, we don't see the lands we reside on as reservations simply because there are still our homelands. This is where our ancestors resided, and we're fortunate to still reside in these communities. And it's important for us to understand that why is it important to learn about the past? Why is it important to ensure that when we talk about history, that we should be able to know who the Pueblo people are, our ancestors, as well as our neighbors throughout this, what we now call the continental United States? Why is it important that we make sure that this history is told accurately? Why is it important that we should make sure that we can differentiate one group from another, not just simply apply, well, they all look alike to us? And simply because it's important for us to make sure that history is told accurately, that the history of the and contributions of indigenous peoples is elemental to the existence of us and our participation as well as our contribution to what we now call the United States and now as US citizens. Many people ask why it's important or why we should talk about the past or learn about the past. Well, one of the reasons why it's important for us to learn about the past is because there are times when we may not always have all the information. Either the information is limited by our own knowledge, it might be skewed by our own belief systems, our own prejudices, or it might simply be not available to us. That's why it's important for us to know about the past. And this is especially true as this country, the United States of America, looks into 2026. We will certainly have parades and efforts to commemorate this experiment that many people have called about democracy. However, democracy is sometimes elusive. Democracy in itself is not fragile. The only thing fragile about democracy is the people who either work to sustain it or work to tear it down. That's what democracy means, because when you break the word democracy into the Greek word, it means governance or support by the people. It's the people, it's not the document, it's not the Constitution, but it's the principle that the people have, which is the basis of why these different indigenous populations existed for as long as they existed, because they existed as a community. Community is essential for us as human beings to reside, to accomplish the things that we do, that we have a support buy-in. As long as we work toward that end, we will have civilizations or societies that thrive and exist in spite of all the turmoil and or complications associated to us as human beings. The two publications you see on your screens are one example, or just two examples of perhaps the myopic components of what history means. Because when we think about the 1619 Project, slavery has always been a human behavior. The right to impose my will on those other guys over there simply because of the way they look, the color of their skin, their belief systems, or whatever it is. And then the 1776 report, which is more recent publication, is simply because some component of our society, some of our fellow citizens felt, well, it doesn't give me a good light. It makes me feel bad because, well, my predecessors did some really bad and stupid stuff. So history, as long as we work to maintain and sustain a civil society, we should also be very diligent to make sure that how we tell history is equally important as why we tell history. And these are two important statements that I really help others understand why they're important for us today, especially in the year 2025. Because if we don't work to sustain and maintain history accurately, inclusively, we're only getting one side of the story. Much like Representative Shirley Chisholm said, if they don't give you a seat at the table, well, then you bring your own chair. As long as people continue to obstruct others, limit others, prevent others from being incorporated into the story of humankind, we will never really know who humankind is, because humankind is us. It should include all of us. Those are the ways that we can understand that history is elemental to us as humankind, that we may not always make the best decisions, but nevertheless, it's humankind that helps us understand who we are and work toward that end. And so in closing, I will simply say that the people who have lived in this part of our country today have always been here. The knowledge that they acquired to sustain and maintain their civilizations, all the things that were elemental to them as a society, all the things that bonded them together as a society, and those things that help them resist and endure in spite of all the other problems that were associated to them as a society, they are still very prevalent, especially those that we now refer to as Pueblo. So in closing, my mother's language, we say thank you, and we say dawae. My father's language, which is a different Pueblo with a different language, we say Eloqua. And certainly I say thank you to those of you who have tuned in. I'm certainly anxious to hear from you. If there's an opportunity that you'd like to perhaps drop me a question, maybe make a comment, there's my email on screen. And I'm going to offer opportunities to answer any questions. Just to let you know, the books you see on my screen are my resources. I am not a historian. I'm not an archaeologist or an anthropologist, but I do my homework so that perhaps maybe you don't have to do it. And so I'm helping you with sort of this virtual cliff notes to help you understand a little bit about who the human beings were, who resided here. We see the evidence of them when we ever go to places like Mesa Verde, Chaco Canyon, Bandelier, the Gila Cliff dwellings, and many other places. We see the evidence of what they did and how they resided. And so my presentations are based on the knowledge and the resources that I use as the background for all the things to help us understand a little bit about the humankind that was here in the Western Hemisphere, and specifically in the Four Corners region. So again, thank you very much. I want to thank the Friends of History for this opportunity to talk with you. I invite you to drop me a line, perhaps a question, either for clarification or for some explanation. And again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John, for providing this fine perspective on past and present Pueblo communities in the Southwest in the greater context of the anthropological approaches to the issue. And personally, thank you for the wonderful selection of photos and graphics that you provided. Many of the photos are quite striking, and the visual graphics are especially informative in the context of your presentation. I do have a couple questions. In a few words, what would you like your audience to remember most from this presentation? What is your takeaway?
I would say, as it applies to, well, I would divide it into two components. First of all, New Mexico citizens. Certainly, New Mexico citizens um, are taught a certain perspective, especially our Hispanic neighbors, our non-Pueblo members, is that New Mexico contributes a lot to, like I said, world history and scientific discovery and uncovering of humankind in the Western Hemisphere. Most other places, because of the climate, the environment, whatever evidence that was there at some point, either decays or is lost simply because of erosion and decay and so forth. But here in the Four Corners region, we're fortunate that not only do we have it here, many of these places we have access to. And so when we do go to those kinds of places like Mesa Verde, Chaco, so forth, I think just not just viewing it, in a sense, seeing it, but really kind of taking some time to learn a little bit more about it. And when I talk about that kind of perspective, it always reminds me of the movie Vacation. Perhaps some of your viewers out there will see it. Is that when Chevy Chase is taking his kids down to Wally World, they stop at the Grand Canyon, and he kind of looks at it and then turns around and walks back. He sees it, but doesn't really look at it. And perhaps maybe because he's got his mother-in-law on the top of his car, he's got his kids who want to get to Wally World. His wife's giving him issues. He's got Christy Brinkley making Google eyes in that red Corvette. So he's got all of these things on his mind, but he doesn't take the time to really learn and understand that human beings were really here. And so I think for New Mexico citizens, if we visit these places, we're fortunate that we have the evidence of humankind throughout this, what we now call the state of New Mexico. And for those who are non-New Mexico citizens and maybe just recently moved here, is that New Mexico contributes to, long before the United States becomes the United States, that there was some sense of governance here. There was an autonomy here. There were human beings that live in large societies and civilizations, and these societies have given and contributed a lot to what we call this country, and actually, to tell you the truth, this entire world. Because when you think about certain foods that are here, corn, beans, squash, potatoes, tomatoes, cocoa, tobacco, plantains, chili, avocados, quinoa, pumpkins, peanuts, so many, many more things. None of those things resided on the other side of the world. They only existed on this side of the world. And none of those, it's important to understand, none of those things grow in the wild. They all have to be cultivated. They all require some component of humans to do something, to hybridize them, to cultivate them, to grow them. Because if you simply threw those seeds out somewhere, they're not going to grow. Humans have to do something to ensure that those crops become part of the commerce of what it means to be a civil society. So being mindful of that, thinking about the contributions of the indigenous populations, and then making that connection that some of these communities are still here. They celebrate their existence because of the learned skills that their predecessors gave them. That's why we have our feast days, our ceremonies, to say we would not be here without what our ancestors gave us. I think those would be the two things that I would say if I was going to help someone understand who the Pueblo people are.
Yes, thank you very much. Secondly, the Pueblo community, even with the internal diversity of their cultural expression, are recognized for the ability to have retained a distinct social, cultural, and political autonomy, which, of course, you highlighted effectively, as well as being able to retain parts of their historic homeland. Most notable is, of course, the rightly proud of the fact that they've been able to stay on their home in lands that they have recognized historically as the embodiment of who and who they are. What characteristics specifically of Pueblo culture and the changing relationship of the publics with their Spanish conquerors during the colonial period that you believe were integral to their resistance and notable retention of the homeland since contact with the West?
That's certainly a complicated question and
Yes, it
not
is. I
easily, yeah, no worries, not easily addressed, but I would say perhaps the three key points of what enabled them to sustain as well as maintain and perpetuate those components, their societies, stems from the fact, number one, that the representatives of the Spanish crown acknowledged them as human beings. If they had not been acknowledged as human beings, they could simply have been imprisoned, enslaved, and killed without any disregard for them, simply because these things which which are referred to as papal bulls, which justified colonization, which justified and indemnified the expansion of the Spanish crown, especially into the Western Hemisphere, that they could do these things and be forgiven for it. They could be indemnified for it because the Roman Catholic Church wanted to expand its influence, but you have to accept another person as a real human being with a soul and a spirit to then work to evangelize to them. If they had simply been seen as barbarians, as savages, Berbers, and whatever other names that have been given other civilizations, they could have been simply enslaved and killed without any disregard for them. And then why would you build churches to force them to go to and bring them into the Catholic fold at that time? And then certainly perhaps maybe the adaptation and the acknowledgement that some of our Pueblo fellow members back then historically, as well as even today, engage and embrace the Catholic faith, as well as other religions, that they see themselves as worthy of the religious dogma, tenet, doctrine of whatever religion they choose to believe, that they are human just as well. And then lastly, I would say that their predecessors, their ancestors, that we see the evidence of Chaco and Mesa Verde, that we can go to those places and see the physical evidence. And that's why I don't use the word ruins, because they're not ruins to us as Pueblo people. They are evidence, the evidence of problem solving, of strategic planning, of sophistication of language, that I can have this perspective in my brain, then I can translate it to another person through my language and say, well, we have to start here. We have to build this. We have to do this. It's time to plant. It's time to do this. This is how you deliver a child. This is what you do to prepare for the next season. All of these things are elemental to what constitutes a civilization. So those three things, I would say, that the acceptance and the acknowledgement of the representatives of the Spanish crown to see the groups of people who are human. The second thing was that they were able to then perhaps maybe find or accept the evangelization of the religious belief systems of others as well as their own, because if anybody has ever gone to our feast days, you know that it begins with Mass in the Catholic Church, but then they'll perform and do the ceremonies that they've always done, that their ancestors have done. So it's this hybridization of these two belief systems for the resilience of the society and the community. And then lastly, that they were able to find that component of all that encompasses this society was developed through their predecessors, and by simply speaking the language, celebrating the ceremonies, doing the things in our communities, it validates our ancestors. It gives them their acknowledges their very existence. And the reason why I say that is that, as you mentioned before, that we certainly are fortunate to live on our homelands, whereas perhaps maybe others indigenous cultures don't have that opportunity. A good example would be the state of Oklahoma. In Oklahoma, there are 39 what we call federally recognized Native American communities. But of those 39 Native American communities, only 5 call that their traditional homelands. That's where they have always lived. Their predecessors always lived there. The other 35, it was during the Jacksonian administration. That's when they were moved from places like Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, West Virginia, Ohio, Kentucky, and other places westward, simply because westward expansion was pushing all of those people out. This idea of manifest destiny was causing them that you guys are in the way, but we want you over there. And so when anyone considers how they want to identify who they are as a human being, we do that through our languages. As a matrilineal society, that there was no such thing as last names until the other side of the world came to this side of the world. There were no Smiths or Joneses or Andersons or Garcias, Luceros, Romeros, or nothing like that. How you identified who you were, especially as a matrilineal society, was you would perhaps go through a process of saying, this is who I am, this name that perhaps maybe my grandmother gave me. I come from this community. My mother is this person. My grandmother is this person. Our clan is this. And so by doing that, then someone who understands my language might say, oh, I know who you are because I know who your mother is, or I know who your grandmother is. And so, or we're the same clan system. And so those are the things I think it would it's sort of helpful for us to understand why our Pueblo communities exist the way they do, because we're fortunate that we live on our homelands in spite of those who have not had that opportunity, our neighbors throughout this what we now call the United States.
Well, thank you for a very thorough response to my question. It's much appreciated, and I know the audience will as well. And just thank you for the time that you've given to us. It's been a joy having you here and to get your perspective on these issues. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the invitation, and first of all, the consideration to speak with you. Certainly, I hope that there's other opportunities to do so. And again, my email is Badger, BADGERPRODN @gmail.com. And I invite anybody to give me a call or drop me a line. I would love to hear from you. I'll be glad to respond to any kind of questions or inquiries.
Yes, always look forward to a very important dialogue. For our audience, as you know, this lecture is pre-recorded, so there is no opportunity for you to ask questions. So just feel free to reach out to John, who would be more than welcome to talk with you and answer any queries you have or respond to any comments. Should you wish to learn more about the Pueblo community, check out the books which John has highlighted at the end of his presentation as a beginning or as a further enrichment in terms of your reading on the subject. In closing, a reminder to our listeners to visit our webpage at friendsofhistorynm.org, where you can rewatch this lecture and other Friends of History First Wednesday lectures covering a wide range of topics about New Mexico and more broadly, Southwestern history. Just click on the lecture series link at the top of the Friends of History homepage, then go to past lectures to see the list and to also identify future and upcoming presentations. If you are interested in learning more about our upcoming lectures and more broadly about the Friends of History, we encourage you to join us through our mailing list by emailing us at the email provided below. Finally, we request that you consider making a donation, however small, to the Friends of History through the webpage so that the Friends of History can continue to support programming at the New Mexico History Museum. Just go to the donation page on our website, which is provided below. And thank you to all who have contributed to the Friends of History over the years. We look forward to seeing you all in the months ahead. Thank you and goodbye for now.